Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome our audience and our speakers to When Plants Kill with Chelsey Siemens and Jenifer Heyden from the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. Welcome on behalf of the Alberta AgriSystems Living Lab and our audience. I'd like to take a minute to acknowledge that members of the Alberta AgriSystems Living Lab team are grateful to live, work, and be in relation with people from across many traditional territories covering all regions of Western Canada. This acknowledgement is to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving our relationships and our own understanding of local Indigenous people, their cultures, and knowledge. So I'd like to take this moment to introduce Chelsey Siemens. Welcome, Chelsey and Jenifer. We're looking forward to your presentation, and I'll let you take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks a lot for having us, and we're excited to speak to you this evening. My name is Chelsey Siemens. I'm a livestock and feed extension specialist with Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture in Kindersley. And I live and work with my family on a mixed farm east of Kindersley at Fisk. Some of my particular interests are range management and also helping producers navigate through using alternative feeds in beef cow rations. So I'm really interested to talk to you this evening about some of those topics.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jenifer Heyden. I'm the Livestock and Feed Extension Specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. I'm based out of the North Battleford office. So I've been there for about 15 years now, but was born and raised in East Central Alberta and worked for some time there as well. So like Chelsey, I'm interested in those sort of forage and livestock type relationships and how all of those systems interact. And I think without anything further, we can get started here. So just in terms of an outline about what Chelsey and I are going to talk to you about tonight, and we'll kind of go back and forth between the two of us. We'll talk about the different types of poisoning or toxicity that we might see. We'll talk about some sensitivity to those toxins, common symptoms that we might look for, problem weeds and other poisonous plants on pasture. And then we're going to kind of switch gears and talk more about those polycrops, a little bit on composition and species, some of the considerations and anti-nutritional factors that maybe we want to think about when seeding those types of crops, and some general sort of management considerations and final thoughts. So in terms of types of toxicity, we can have both acute, so that one-time exposure, it's very damaging. The animal dies within a few feet of the plant or soon thereafter. So if you're familiar with something like water hemlock, that would be one of those things where we've got that acute type poisoning. Or if we look in terms of chronic poisoning, so that repeat exposure over long periods of time. Often with this, we'll see some of that reduced gain, general unthriftiness. And not all toxic plants will kill the animal. Some of them will simply have some, lasting damage or lasting effects, but they won't necessarily kill the animal. So there's a number of different types of toxins. They have many different mechanisms, act on various body organs or systems. So we have different types of poisoning, different toxic substances. So some of the things that we will, that are common in some of the plants that we'll talk about tonight, oxalates. So these cause kidney failure, things like kochia contain oxalates. And some of these toxic substances we are maybe able to test for, some not so much. And so sometimes we just make general recommendations on how much of a certain type of plant we could use in a ration, or that we could get away with safely grazing. So oxalates is maybe one of those where it's a little bit harder for testing. Glucosinolates, these will interfere with thyroid function. They cause some liver and kidney damage. So things like brassicas, your kale, radishes, turnips, canola, plants in that brassica family. We also have alkaloids. So these may irritate the digestive tract. They can also act on the central nervous system. So it just depends on the type of alkaloid that we're talking about. So if we're talking about ergot, we may find that in rye, triticale, wheat, sometimes even barley. We can also find some alkaloids as well in smooth brome grass. So that is not, I would not say that we often see that, but certainly can be present at times. Cyanogens, these interfere with oxygen exchange from the lungs to the body tissues, so that various tissues, including the brain, are then starved for oxygen. So these animals generally perish from asphyxiation. And often these are one of those where we see that acute poisoning. It's something that's going to happen quickly. So one of the examples here would be flax. Nitrates, I'm sure everyone is familiar with nitrates. So again, that sort of oxygen starvation. So often similar type symptoms to those cyanogens. And that nitrate poisoning can be acute or it can be chronic, and just depends on the dose. The other type of poisoning or toxic substance that we want to talk about would be fungus or mold. And then these molds they may have mycotoxins associated with them. So in terms of fungus, we'd be talking more about ergot. When we talk about those mycotoxins, we're maybe talking more about fusarium or penicillium, something that has the potential to produce mycotoxins such as vomitoxin, zearalenone, HT2, those types of substances. And these will have various effects on the body. We might simply have feed refusal, or maybe those animals aren't doing as well as they should. Some of these mycotoxins are responsible for abortions as well, or maybe we have changes in milk production. And let's not forget about those plants that can also cause, photosensitization or mechanical injury. So it's not just about those ones that have those effects on those different body systems or on those different organs, but also, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about photosensitization and mechanical injury as well. So with photosensitization, it's sort of that, almost that sunburn or that blistering of the muzzle or the udder or those other light areas of the animal. So often easier to see on some of those light-skinned animals. And these toxic substances then can cause photosensitization, but they can also have hepatogenic effects. So meaning that they impair liver function and can cause liver damage as well. And then with mechanical injury, so, maybe they're causing physical injury to the animal, either externally or internally. So some of these things, maybe awns on different types of barley or different types of grasses that have got those long awns associated with them. Or maybe we're talking about the burrs that are associated with burdock, something like that. So we still have to consider those, and those things are not likely to, they're not likely to poison an animal, so to speak, or cause death, but certainly cause discomfort to those animals. So in terms of sensitivity to those poisonous plants, this is going to be dependent on the species that we're talking about. So sheep and horses tend to be a little bit more sensitive than what cattle are. Cows tend to be a little bit more sensitive than goats. If we look at age of the animal, we have, those young animals and old animals are probably more prone, more sensitive to some of those toxins or to that poison. Also time of year, so spring versus fall. And it just depends on sort of the stage that plant is in, or maybe, and I think this fits a little bit with plant parts as well. In that, when those plants are young and growing, those leaves are, if the toxin is in the leaves, maybe spring is going to be a more sensitive time of year. If the toxins are in the seeds, well, then maybe fall is when we have that, is when we see that. So why are toxic plants eaten? Lots of these poisonous plants actually produce toxins that kind of discourage grazing. So they'll often result in a bad taste or smell, but not all the time. Actually, some of these plants, because they're not, we wouldn't think of them as being toxic or necessarily poisonous. Some of them end up actually being quite palatable, and that can be part of the problem. Some of the other reasons that we might see these toxic plants being eaten when desirable grazing is scarce. So if you've kind of run out of pasture and animals are looking and seeking something that is green, they'll sometimes, they'll eat these the toxic plants, even though they shouldn't. So even though they might taste bad or they might smell bad, if there's not a lot of grass there available, they're going to look for something that's green, and they're going to eat those up. If we've got drought or areas that we wouldn't typically use, so maybe you are using an area that has not previously been fenced off, or maybe you are using an area where maybe there is typically water in that area. Some of these areas we see more, I would say, seaside arrowgrass and some plants like that in areas that, previously are covered by water, and now we are using those for grazing. Also, young animals that are exploring. We know that young calves are curious. They like to kind of, they get into stuff. We know that. So they're exploring. They're often picking up these plants and just tasting them. And sometimes that can be a deadly combination there. When animals are moved. So are we moving animals from one pasture to another? Are we moving them down a road allowance? Are we moving them down a ditch or, across the road, something like that, where they have access to plants that they wouldn't normally have access to? And, when they're kind of on the move like that, and they're not necessarily concentrating on what they're wrapping their tongue around and eating, they're just sort of, they're grabbing something and they're moving on and they're chewing it as they're going. Also, toxic plants that have been baled up. So maybe, again, maybe we are baling up some of those forages in the ditches, or maybe we are baling up areas that would normally be covered by water. Sometimes those areas will have plants there that are toxic that normally wouldn't be exposed and wouldn't be eaten, but now we've baled them up and we're feeding them out. And then the other problem too is those repeat offenders. And you guys all know that this is something that happens. It seems to be, it's similar to bloat. We've always got that one cow that bloats. Well, you've always got that one cow that's a repeat offender too. It doesn't matter if she, has that photosensitization, ends up with that blistering on her nose from something that she's eaten. She's probably going to eat it again. And that's just kind of the way things go sometimes. So some of those common symptoms, and I think some of these will vary just depending on whether or not, we're talking about those acute symptoms or those chronic symptoms. So I would say the first couple on here, that standing alone, that disoriented, those would be symptoms of sort of that acute poisoning. We're going to see those changes very, very quickly, those things. Some of the others, holding the head down, they just kind of are generally unthrifty. They don't look well. That feed refusal, that shaggy coat, those would be symptoms of a more chronic problem. Drinking lots of water, again, that's probably more of an acute type system. So diagnosis and treatment. So diagnosis is not always easy. I think sometimes there's a lot of contributing factors in a lot of these sort of cases that we see or phone calls that we get, conversations that we have. And we have to remember too that treatment is not always possible, especially obviously in the case of that acute poisoning. But even sometimes with that chronic poisoning, we're not always able to treat those animals. And in that acute poisoning, even if those animals have not perished, again, treatment is not always possible. And by way of contributing factors, I think we have to think about water as well, because often, you know, especially in times of drought, some of the areas where we have problems are areas where we also have issues with water. So whether that's water quality, we've got a concentration of minerals in that water due to that drought, so we don't have that we don't have that recharge of those waterways, or maybe we've got blue-green algae in some of that water. And then the other thing that we have to think about as well is quantity. Like, do we have enough water there? How much water is there? And the other contributing factor that I think we see as well is other plants. Like, what else is growing there? Because oftentimes it's not just one plant that's there. And I think I just want to, in 2021, we saw this quite a bit, and often with dire consequences. So water receded in those sloughs and dugouts. Minerals are concentrated in that water. Add to the fact that plants such as seaside arrowgrass and water hemlock that wouldn't normally be in, they wouldn't normally be in abundance, or they wouldn't be present, or if they were, there weren't that many of them, or they were left alone by animals. So these were now in abundance and they were accessible. And in many cases, blue-green algae was also a contributing factor with these. So we had, a number of cases up here in the Northwest, Saskatchewan for sure, where it just seemed to be a contribution of many different things, where producers lost animals, or they had animals that weren't doing well, and was just a number of different factors there that were at play. And Chelsey, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jen. I'm going to spend some time going through some range type plants and weeds one at a time, and we'll discuss some of the common ones that we see causing problems. So Jenifer did allude to water hemlock. I consider this one probably the most toxic poisonous plant. It's one of those where it causes acute toxicity and can be lethal to cows and other livestock in very small amounts. It's cyclotoxin is what causes the poisoning, and it acts on the nervous system. And because the toxin is quick acting, often the only thing that we will see is dead livestock in the close vicinity to water hemlock. So there's usually nothing we can do about it after the fact. And usually it's just a case of identifying that plant and ruling out other causes of death for those livestock. The last 2 summers saw a fair number of cases of water hemlock poisoning in West Central Saskatchewan. And again, this was in a lot of areas where they had been historically flooded or underwater. Then that water had receded or dried up, and then cattle were grazing areas that they had not normally been grazing in the past. I always tell people to be very cautious when identifying a suspected water hemlock plant. There's some identifying characteristics. We can look at the leaves, and also at the bottom of the stalk, it's often kind of an enlarged type bulb, as you can see in the picture on the screen, with membranes that go across horizontally, dividing that. However, if you are looking at this plant or suspect water hemlock in your pasture and you are opening up that stalk to look at it, please be very cautious about handling that plant, as that bottom of the stalk is the most toxic part, the sap within there, and it's also very toxic to humans. So just be very careful at looking at this one. Because very small amounts are toxic very quickly with this plant, I would consider this one where no amount is safe. And really the approach to take to this one is identifying the water hemlock and then restricting access to livestock if possible. There's a couple of lookalike plants that are not toxic, which make it kind of hard. Cow parsnip and water parsnip look similar, especially when we're looking at the flower. However, we can identify them based on the leaves, and also, like I was saying, based on the bottom of that stalk, if we're able to open up that enlarged part at the bottom of the stalk and look for those horizontal membranes that separate them. In the last couple of years, like I said, when we had kind of those dried up wetland areas where we did see water hemlock, a lot of the times it was a lot shorter and a lot less robust of a plant than expected. When you look at some of the guides and the photos that you see online, it does tend to be a fairly large plant when it grows along stream sides. So just something to keep in mind in dry conditions, it can be quite a bit smaller and quite a bit less noticeable. Jenifer also mentioned seaside arrowgrass, so another one that causes acute toxicity in fairly small amounts, contains cyanide, which again will cause symptoms that contribute to nervousness, trembling, erratic breathing, and death. And on post-mortem, kind of the distinguishing characteristic of poisoning by seaside arrowgrass is that bright red blood and the smell of bitter almonds in the stomach. And this one, if it is baled up for hay, that toxicity can persist in the dry forage as well. This one often is found in kind of saline areas or wet areas, and it often grows in combination with other rushes and sedges, and it can be fairly hard to distinguish from those other plants. And this is also an accumulator of salts from the soil. So kind of a risk factor is if cattle are seeking salt, they may ingest a lot of seaside arrowgrass if they don't have another source of salt. It also grows really rapidly in the spring, so it might be one of the first things to green up. So again, like Jenifer said, early spring is one of those risk factors when not a lot of other green forages are actively growing, and livestock are out there looking for the first green things growing. They might be more likely to ingest this than they are at other times. Death camas is another one. It's very common in Saskatchewan and Alberta. It's another one where all parts of the plants are poisonous, especially the bulb. It does look very similar to a wild onion, although it can be distinguished from wild onion because it doesn't have the onion smell. And it also has a V-shaped leaf compared to the flat leaves of an onion. Sheep are most susceptible to poisoning, but there have been cases of cattle being poisoned by this as well. And again, it takes a fairly small amount of death camas to cause death. And it's also one that continues to be poisonous in hay. And as Jenifer said on her slide, talking about, combinations of risk factors, in some cases where I've seen water hemlock, I've also seen death camas in the same area. So it can be, hard to drill down into the reason for cattle mortalities when we have more than one poisonous plant located in the same area. A similar plant called white camas also has the same toxic compounds, but it is not as toxic as death camas, and again causes similar symptoms. So those were the ones that I would consider kind of acute poisonous plants that we wouldn't consider any amount of them safe for consumption by livestock. I'm going to move into kind of the second class of plants that I'm going to talk about, which we consider toxic only in high proportions of the diet. So kochia has come up a lot, in the last few years. Kochia can actually be a fairly good source of energy and protein in rations. However, there's three things that can be high and can really limit its use in the ration. The first is oxalates, the second is sulfur, and the third is nitrates. So oxalates can cause depressed appetite, incoordination, spasms, and jaundice. And because oxalates are not easy to test for, that's where we have a general recommendation to keep that kochia to 25 to 30% maximum in the total ration in order to make sure that oxalate content doesn't exceed the levels where it's likely to cause issues for the livestock. Sulfur and nitrates, on the other hand, that's something that we can test for at any feed testing labs. Those two things are not always included on your standard feed test, so we have to make sure that we're ordering an analysis that includes sulfur and nitrates, or adding those on to your basic feed test. And then we can, when we're feeding preserved feed that may be high in sulfur and or nitrates, we often have the opportunity to dilute that feed enough with other feed ingredients that we can create a safe ration. On the topic of sulfur, though, and nitrates, we also have to be sure to look at the quality of the water that livestock are on at the same time, as water can contain sulfates and nitrates, and the combination of all the feed ingredients plus the water needs to be taken into consideration when we're looking at the overall ration. Very similar to kochia, lamb's quarters also can have high levels of oxalates and can also accumulate nitrates. And red root pigweed is in the same category. So with these weeds, if we're in a grazing situation, if there is a potential for that to make up a very large portion of the livestock's ration, that might be something to think about. If it's more of a sporadic occurrence of these plants here and there, that's not something to worry as much about. Jenifer mentioned glucosinolates. So wild mustard would be one of those weeds that contains glucosinolates, which can interfere with the synthesis of thyroid hormones. And again, this is more of kind of a chronic or not acute type poisoning, but something that if wild mustard is making up a large portion of the ration could be an issue for livestock. Stinkweed has the same glucosinolates, and because those glucosinolates are soluble in the milk, they can actually taint the milk, which I'm sure you've heard about in the past. Field horsetail is an interesting one. It contains thiaminase, which can cause thiamine deficiency, and horses are most susceptible to this. Horses are not super likely, I don't think, to eat field horsetail in large amounts in a grazing type situation. I'm sure you're familiar with field horsetail. There's the kind of two forms. There's the fern type form, and then there's the other form that looks almost like asparagus. However, it is more palatable in hay. So if people are haying, again, areas that had been previously flooded that might have a lot of field horsetail in them, hay containing around 20% field horsetail fed over a period of 2 weeks or more can cause nervous incoordination, and horses will eventually go down and be unable to get back up again. This is something that can usually be reversed if you remove that feed from them. Common groundsel is another weed, maybe not as common, but it has been linked to cases of younger calves. Again, nervousness, incoordination, pushing against objects, or having that blindness with glazed eyes or head pressing. And that's again due to the alkaloids, which will cause those nervous systems as well as irreversible liver damage if they're chronically exposed over a long period of time. And then Jenifer mentioned the photosensitization. Alside clover, most often seen in horses. Again, most often recognized when we have the light-skinned horses on their muzzle and around their hooves. Sometimes on darker-skinned horses, you might not always notice that photosensitization, but there can be liver damage occurring at that same time as well. And again, along with the liver damage, there's also a potential for that, anorexia, losing weight, and neurological issues such as aimless walking or head pressing. Leafy spurge, this is one that's interesting because that latex sap inside the stems and the leaves can be an irritant to the skin and mouth. But as we know, different classes of livestock, including cattle and sheep and goats, can kind of successfully learn to graze leafy spurge in fairly high quantities if they're introduced to it gradually. So this is just kind of a heads up. It's more of an issue maybe with naive animals that haven't been grazing leafy spurge before. It's not something that you would want to introduce real rapidly to their ration in large amounts, but with some slow introduction, it's something that they can graze, but just as a bit of a caution that sap does cause irritation. And reed canary grass. This is something that I haven't seen in person be an issue, and the seed varieties that are currently on the market are low alkaloid varieties. But if there are older stands of reed canary grass, there is a potential for diarrhea and weight loss, as well as some alkaloids in that grass, which could cause incoordination and muscle stiffness. Loco weed, Chronic disease that causes depression, incoordination, and death can result in rare cases. Pregnant animals can abort or give birth to young with congenital deformities. So early yellow local weed really needs to be consumed in large amounts and over a long period of time in order for issues to occur. And usually if we are removing cattle or sheep from the local weed, those symptoms usually reverse themselves. Low larkspur is a little bit unique in the fact that it is really palatable to livestock, so it does tend to be sought out by them compared to some of these other species that are only consumed if there's really nothing else available. And it's common in the Cypress Hills area. Cattle and horses are susceptible to poisoning, but sheep are not, and it's most dangerous early in the season. And then we have a couple of milk vetches, which again are not technically toxic or poisonous, but in some cases can accumulate high levels of selenium. So as you probably know, selenium is an essential nutrient, but there's a narrow range between what is required by livestock and what is too much or would create toxicity for livestock. So this is just something to keep in mind, especially as other sources of selenium are offered to livestock in salt or supplements, that there have been cases in the past where this high selenium in narrow-leaved or two-grooved milk vetch has actually contributed to selenium toxicity in combination with other supplements. And then lupins, when consumed by cows during early pregnancy, there is a potential for calves to be born with deformities, including crooked calf syndrome or cleft palate. This is something that occurs early in gestation between day 50 and day 80 of gestation. So as you can imagine, that could be very hard to link back to a certain plant when you're not seeing the symptoms of that happening until many months later once calves are born. So I think it would be a very thorough investigation that would have to be made in order to link those types of deformities in calves back to lupins in pasture, but it's something that's been documented. And then I'm not going to get into these too much. I'm just going to mention maybe a couple that I think are interesting and that we don't often think about. In particular, chokecherry and Saskatoon berry, leaves and branches. Again, the toxic factor in those is cyanide. And it's a relatively small amount, so around 6 to 7 pounds of chokecherry or Saskatoon berry leaves would be enough to potentially be lethal to a fully grown cow. And of course, not something that cattle or other livestock would probably willingly consume under most circumstances. But again, if we were in a special situation where there was, a real lack of other forages available, or, in some situation where maybe a bunch of leaves or prunings were being thrown into a pasture from outside of that pasture, just something to keep in mind that especially early on in the spring, those leaves and branches are quite toxic. And as Jenifer mentioned, just a list of some common plants that can cause mechanical injury, abscesses and other injuries like that. I'm going to turn it back over to Jenifer now to talk about seeded forages.
So as I mentioned sort of in the outline, one of the things that was asked of us was if we could touch a bit on some of those seeded forages or those polycrops. So things that would be, polycrops have become very popular, I would say, in the last probably 5 years or so, maybe a little bit better than that. So I thought I would touch on a few of those here tonight as well. So some of the reasons, why we might use polycrops, and there's a number of different reasons. And I think, the last few years, probably 3 years, have certainly, we've seen a lot more interest in these polycrops. And part of that is providing some relief to pastures during the summer or during a difficult growing season. Maybe we're hedging our bets on forage growth. We've got multiple species, which means we've got multiple opportunities for growth and in different environmental conditions. Some plants will do better than others under different conditions and different stresses. Maybe we're using them to extend the grazing season. We maybe are providing some improved forage quality for livestock. A lot of these blends are, they're high protein, high energy, and sometimes a lot of biomass. So we do have that potential for improving that forage quality. Maybe we are wanting to try something new and different. Or maybe it's the fact that they can be grazed, baled, or put up as silage, depending on the mix. And both are, goals or maybe our situation. So there's a lot of reasons why we might look to using those polycrops. Next. So I want to talk a little bit about composition, and I think in the newest sense of the word polycrop, we're talking about annuals and sometimes short-lived perennials. But I think looking back, there's a lot of perennial blends that have been used for hay and pasture, that if we look at the very basic sense of the word, we might also consider these as a polycrop. For the purposes of the rest of this presentation, we're going to focus on those annuals and some of those short-lived perennials. So when we talk about composition, it really, it depends on the blend. Are we talking about 2 species? Are we talking 4? Are we talking 8? Are we talking more than that? And some of these blends will contain quite a number of different species. So just a few, examples here across the bottom of the screen in those pictures where we've got, just sort of that, we've just got two there, the oats and peas, so a cereal and a legume, or maybe we're looking at adding a warm season, something like corn, and then adding a brassica, as well as that cereal and that legume, so sort of that picture in the middle there. Or maybe we are looking at something that's got, a larger number of species. I think when we talk about that composition, we have to remember that what we seed isn't necessarily what we get in that field. So there's a difference between the percentage in the blend versus what actually grows in the field. Sometimes we don't have the right moisture or the temperatures to necessarily accommodate everything that was seeded. So what we see coming up isn't necessarily the same as what we put down, or at least not in the same percentages. And I think it's really interesting to know what's in those blends, and then to go back there in the summer and in the fall when that blend is growing really well, and just see what's there compared to what you seeded. Sometimes those cool season species tend to produce a bit more biomass, and I think maybe that's location dependent, and maybe it's just that a lot of those, we've done a lot of research. So these would be things like your cereal crops. So there's lots of research done on those species, and I think we've come a long way. We know what works well. So if you're seeding something that you're used to seeding, or something that grows well in your area, of course we're going to see more biomass from those things. And like I said, that stand composition is going to be really dependent on moisture, and not just at seeding, but throughout that growing season. And it's also dependent on temperature, whether that's growing degree days or heat units. A lot of those, those warm season plants are really dependent on temperature. So if we look at some of those forage types, and I've alluded to some of these already, I would say there's probably 4 basic categories that I would put those forages into. So warm season, cool season, legumes, brassicas. So under your warm season forages, this is things like corn or millet, sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, sunflowers. Cool season, I mean, these are very common. So your barley, oats, triticale, maybe buckwheat would fit in there as well. And then our legumes, so peas, faba beans, your hairy vetch, soybean, things like that. And then your brassicas, we're talking kale, radish, turnips, canola. So now that we've talked about what, some of those different species, I just want to speak sort of in general terms about what some of those anti-nutritional factors might be of those polycrops. And don't get me wrong, I think those polycrops, we have a lot of potential for really good nutritional quality. So it's not that they're not nutritious, and that's not that we shouldn't be using them, but I do think that we do have to be aware of some of the issues that can come up when we are using them. So I'm just going to touch on some of those things now. So one of those things would be sulfur. And Chelsey talked a bit about this in terms of some of those poisonous plants on pasture as well. So that sulfur binds to trace minerals, things like copper. Copper would be the big one, which then leads to some of those trace mineral deficiencies. We can see things like polio, sometimes death as well, depending on just how high that sulfur is. Often blindness would be one of the other things that we see with sulfur. And we have to remember too that we often have high sulfur levels or sulfate levels in water. So if we've got high sulfate water, and then we also have sulfur in those plants that those cattle are grazing on, then we've got two sources of that sulfur there, and we can end up with some problems. So these would be things like those brassicas, so that kale, the canola, mustard, turnips, radishes, those types of plants would tend to be higher in sulfur. Nitrates. So again, we talked a little bit about nitrates already. So that nitrate accumulates resulting from a stress event. So lots of times, frost is the big one, right? That's the first thing that comes to mind. But drought and hail also, any sort of event that causes stress on those plants as they're growing can result in nitrate accumulation. The other thing we have to remember is that often we see these nitrates in crops that have been heavily fertilized. So, I think a lot of the polycrops now, we move away from some of that fertilization. But there's probably still some instances where, if we're going and we're soil testing and it shows that we maybe need a bit of nitrogen, if we're using some of that nitrogen fertilizer, we want to really be aware that nitrate could be an issue. Typically found in cereal crops, oilseed crops, so canola, notorious for accumulating nitrate. Some weeds as well, and Chelsey talked about these. Some research has also shown that we end up with higher nitrates in warm season versus cool season crops. So things like millet and sorghum or sorghum Sudan grass, they might accumulate that nitrate a little bit more or at higher levels than some of our cool season crops, so those typical cereal crops that we would have. So we've got potassium as well. So our maximum tolerable level of potassium in the diet for cattle is around that 2 to 2.5% of dry matter. So we can have both issues with potassium toxicity in and of itself, and then also the fact that potassium can interfere with magnesium and calcium absorption. So we predispose those animals to things like tetany. So typically these would be, those older cows that are closer to calving, and cows with a calf at side also can be susceptible as well. And these are cows that, they tend to be sort of, I would say, in that 5 to 6 years old, maybe 5 to 7 years old, where they're no longer able to mobilize as much of that calcium and magnesium from the bone. And so they have a tendency to go down. So characterized by staggering gait, they're kind of nervous or excitable, muscle tremors as well. So I guess in terms of, prevention, intervention, what do we do about some of these things that we, now we're aware that they might happen? What do we do to prevent that? And I think the biggest one, so I'm going to say it 3 times, feed test, feed test, feed test. That's probably your safest way in terms of intervening and knowing what's going to go on there. if you know what you've got there, then maybe you have a better way to be able to deal with it. And then we also have to remember, and we've talked about this already tonight, that water can also contribute, in particular to that sulfur and that nitrate. So we also want to test that water as well. You know, if we've got access to some water testing, not a bad idea to be doing that, so that we can look at that water test, we look at that feed test, and just see, you know, does something kind of stand out there? And this is just going to sort of bring that point home about the sulfur and nitrate. So this is a feed test from a feed lab. So it just is described as a forage, a polycrop blend. And so circled there in red is the sulfur level, so 0.34. So that's not terrible, but I guess we have to look at it from the point of view of what's our maximum tolerable level of sulfur in the diet. So if those animals are on a high grain diet, our maximum level is kind of around 0.3%. So we'd be pushing it with this forage in this polycrop blend. If those animals are on a high forage diet, closer to 0.5% for that maximum sulfur level. So we would probably be okay. But I think it would be really dependent on what our water quality was like at that point. And then nitrate on here, so in the yellow there, 0.92. So the nitrate, our cautionary limit is about 0.5% on a dry matter basis. So our nitrates here in this example are 0.92. So we would not want to just turn cattle out onto this polycrop blend free choice with a nitrate level that's almost it's just shy of 1%. This is a feed that we would need to introduce slowly and gradually, and over time. Yes, we could increase the amount that they were getting, and we could move closer to using this as full feed, but we certainly would not want to start there. And if we did, we would see some of those nitrate toxicity problems coming through in those cattle. So there's just a few more things that I want to talk about that I think maybe would be some of these will be a little bit harder to test for. I mean, nitrate and sulfate, pretty easy to check. One of these would be sort of that oil or fat content. So high oil or fat in the diet is going to impair rumen function. So just kind of slows everything down, makes it harder for that rumen to work properly. Sometimes we also have potential for palatability issues with some of these crops as well. So this would be things like canola, mustard, flax, sunflowers. So anything that's sort of those, your typical oil seeds is where we would see that higher content. And particularly if those plants were taken, if they were on the more mature side where we've got seed development. Prussic acid or hydrocyanic acid, Chelsey talked a bit about this one already too. So interferes with oxygen use. Animals typically die from asphyxiation, so that oxygen is not available to the tissues. Things like flax, sorghum Sudan grass hybrids. Highest concentration tends to be in the leaves when they are green and growing. So if we've got green flax in some of these blends, that would be, can certainly be a problem. And livestock that are poisoned with prussic acid usually tend to die within several minutes to a few hours after consumption. Doesn't take very long. So this would be one of those cases where we've got that acute poisoning. Typically, we would see sort of that labored breathing. They might be staggering, excessive salivation. Eventually, they're going to collapse and die. And I think Chelsey mentioned as well, too, sort of that smell of bitter almonds is often detected, and that sort of bright cherry red blood that's not going to clot quickly. Levels of prussic acid tend to dissipate with harvest and storage. So if we were to cut this crop and dry it down a bit, we could reduce those levels a bit. Prussic acid is one of those things that we are able to test for. So I would certainly urge you to do that if you've got any of those types of plants in a blend that could accumulate that prussic acid. This one would be similar. So Hairy Vetch, cyanogenic glycosides, so similar, I would say, to that prussic acid, not exactly the same, but working on that same sort of principle. So again, sort of lack of oxygen to the tissues. The other thing that we see or can see with Hairy Vetch is that you have sort of this hypersensitivity or allergic reaction. So again, that photosensitization, we can see a loss of hair, skin sloughing, perhaps ulcers of the mucous membranes, and they may have some nasal discharge, also some scouring or diarrhea. And because of those, I would say because of those ulcers, you're probably these animals maybe aren't doing as well. So just sort of that general unthriftiness again, if it's a long-term type situation. So we've also got, I put sweet clover in here as well. So depending on how you treat sweet clover, you'll have some, it might be short-lived, or it can be longer standing in a stand as well. But nevertheless, I think it's important to talk about. So sweet clover poisoning, not an issue with grazing, but if we've got this in a blend that we put up as hay or we put up as silage, and if that hay is damp or that silage is exposed to oxygen and then becomes contaminated with mold, that sweet clover can contain dicumarol, which can have, it acts as a blood thinner and has some anti-clotting effects associated with it. And so generally not recommended for those pregnant cows or cows that are close to calving. And the kicker too is that the amount of visible mold is not a reliable indicator of the dicumarol content that is there. So just because there's mold does not tell us what the level of that toxin is. And that's true with other toxins and types of mold as well. So some of the further considerations that I think we need to think about as well. So it's kind of top of the list here is something called atypical interstitial pneumonia, also commonly known as fog fever, sometimes seen in the sort of going into fall. If we're moving from sort of a worn out, burned off, grazed down pasture onto something with lush growth. So this isn't just definitely not just polycrops, but any type of lush growth, we can have this happen. So with fog fever or AIP, we'll often see animals that have trouble breathing, they're sort of anxious, or maybe they're grunting, they often froth around the mouth. If you try to move them, you're going to notice that they're sort of reluctant to walk, they're kind of achy. Typically will present itself about 4 to 10 days after we've moved animals onto that feed. And like I said, not just polycrops, but any type of lush green forage that we're moving them onto. And I think we saw some of this in 2021 as well. If we were moving from areas that were some of those pastures that were grazed down pretty high, and then we happened to have, maybe we had a salvage crop from the neighbors, or we had some regrowth canola that we moved cattle out onto. We saw some AIP in those cases, or areas where we had some nice green growth along waterways as well that cattle were moved into. We saw more cases of AIP there as well. So I guess the thing that we want to consider with that, and some of the precautions that we could take, is that we want to make sure that those cattle are full when we move them onto that. So we would treat it very much like we would treat those cattle moving on to an alfalfa type forage. So make sure they're full. We don't want them to be hungry. We don't want that forage to be wet, because we know it's more easily digested when it's wet. And maybe we want to provide a little bit of additional dry roughage or low quality forage, something that can be consumed free choice, that they can kind of come back and forth between those, that lush forage and then also that lower quality dry forage. The other thing that we need to think about with those polycrops is sort of that protein to fiber ratio. So there's a lot of protein in these polycrops, you know, and especially there's a lot of species in there that are high protein, which is, you know, fantastic. They're great quality, but sometimes I think we're providing that extra protein at a time when maybe that cow's requirements are a little bit lower. And she doesn't necessarily need all that protein. But what happens is a lot of that protein is just lost out of the back end of the cow. So those cows are they can be pretty loose, and that those plants are digested quickly. They have a really, you know, they move quickly through the digestive tract. So, you know, maybe another one of those cases where we want to provide a little bit of that additional dry roughage or that low quality forage just to kind of slow down that rumen passage rate. Palatability. So, you know, we're putting these new and different forages out there. So sometimes cows can be like little kids. They can be a little bit picky, and we can have some preferential grazing depending on what we've seeded in that blend. And then dry matter is the other thing to think about. Lots of times these crops are very high moisture, and similar to silage, sometimes that high moisture can limit intake. So some of those, I guess, further considerations that we might have, and I guess I alluded to this already, we've got that, sometimes have that preferential grazing. So some of the research has shown that grass and sorghum tend to be grazed before those brassicas. Similar, you know, brassicas would be similar to things like crimson clover and hairy vetch. And then, you know, forage peas, they're maybe not liked as well. And I think, you know, often we see that with pea straw as well. Sometimes it can be really hard to get cows onto pea straw. Once they're on it, they like it, but it's not their preferred type of straw. And so we see that in a grazing situation as well. So there was a case study from Southeast Saskatchewan. So a producer had seeded a mixture of oats, Japanese millet, corn, Persian clover, some sugar beets, collards, plantain, and chicory. So he moved cattle out in October onto this mixture. He'd had some heavy frosts, and the cows were naive, so they'd never been on a mixture like this before. So they found that what happened, and I guess a case of that preferential grazing, right? So what they found was that those cows they clipped the heads off those oats, ate that grain, so they had high grain consumption. About a week later, found 3 dead cows. However, the cause of death was not determined. So I think a couple of things going on here. We have potential for bloat or acidosis because of, you know, if they go along and they clip off those heads and they're getting a lot of grain that they're not used to having, that can be an issue. The other thing too would be AIP as well, because if they'd moved off of pasture and onto this lush growing mix, certainly that AIP or fog fever, rapid change in diet to, you know, something that is low quality onto something that's superior quality, certainly not something that we could just say no, that, you know, that's not what happened there, but certainly potential for that to happen. And then just a slide here on polycrop management. So I think, you know, forage testing, knowing what you've got there, and regardless of whether you're going to be grazing it or you're going to be, you know, using it as silage, it doesn't matter. We need to go out there and we need to test, and we need to know what we have so that we can kind of manage what we've got there. And then also water testing as well. And especially if, you know, you do that forage test and it comes back and you've got, you know, you've got high or sort of borderline sulfate or nitrate, then certainly you want to be doing that water testing as well. and just some good grazing management strategies. We want to treat those stands same as we would a lush alfalfa stand. We don't want to turn those animals out if they're, without some adaptation period. So maybe limit their intake a little bit. We don't want to turn them out if they're hungry. We want to make sure that they're full when they go out there. Maybe we want to adjust the time of day that we turn them out. So we don't want to turn them out on the dew in the morning. Allow some access to other roughages or dry feed, and just be aware that we can have that selective or that preferential grazing. And maybe we also need to consider supplementation on some of those polycrops. So, if those brassicas that accumulate that sulfur, we want to make sure we've got a high quality trace mineral with, that copper, zinc, manganese, and maybe we're looking at a chelated type mineral to make sure that we sort of keep that sulfur in check on those types of blends. Also make sure that we've got salt out there, and maybe some of that supplementation again is just with some of that other dry feed or access to other forages. And I think, Chelsey, it's back to you.
Thanks a lot. I'm just going to wrap up some of the things we talked about here this evening. So as we talked about, I went through a bunch of different species, and really there's a couple of different categories. So we talked about those species that are really toxic in small amounts and really acutely toxic, such as water hemlock, seaside arrowgrass, and death camas. So those ones I would consider toxic at any level, and really what we can do there is just be aware of what those plants look like, try to do some scouting in both of our grazing areas and also any areas that we're considering haying, as some of those species can continue to be toxic in hay, and just really restricting access by livestock is the biggest thing we can do there to help, as well as trying to reduce some of those risk factors. So again, a lot of that toxicity happens in early spring when not a lot of other green forages are readily available, or in dry conditions or other conditions where there isn't a lot of other choices for the livestock to eat. So sometimes they're being forced to, or are looking to eat those things that they wouldn't normally go after. Going on to the next category is more of those ones that have toxic properties, such as kochia with oxalates. So these ones can be dependent on conditions, and really it's about managing the timing and the amount. So if we're looking at preserved forages, it's a lot easier in those cases sometimes to do some feed testing to see what levels we have, and then to dilute those in the ration to make sure our overall diet is not exceeding any of those limits for things like nitrates and sulfur. Or if we're grazing, just being aware that those things may be present and just doing some risk management. And then, as Jenifer alluded to in her last section, just managing those things where they're not necessarily toxic, but we just have to ensure some management to keep livestock healthy when grazing them, such as alfalfa, clovers, and all of our nitrate accumulators. Jenifer talked about this already, but really, those plants that we know accumulate nitrates, we often think about frost, but it can really be anything that stops that above ground growth of the plant, including hail and drought. And then that nitrate's converted to nitrite in the rumen, which is what causes the issues. So along with our annual cereals, which we usually think about in terms of nitrates in the fall, just keeping in mind that some of those weeds, if they're making up a large portion of what the cattle are grazing or what they may be consuming in hay, we should also consider nitrates there. Unfortunately, there is no blanket test that we can submit our forages to test for all of these different things. What we can certainly test for is nitrate, and we have to keep in mind some labs will do presence of nitrate, so a yes or no, whereas other labs will do a percentage. That yes or no can be helpful if our answer is a no, but if our answer is a yes, nitrate is there, then we'll have to follow up with that to get a percentage so that we can create a plan to dilute that nitrate to a safe level in the ration. As Jenifer mentioned, we can test for prussic acid. We can test for mold and mycotoxins. And as she said, colony forming units or the amount of mold that's there isn't always directly correlated to the toxins. So if that's something we're really concerned about, we may have to pursue further testing to look at the actual mycotoxins there. And then a couple of the things we talked about, including oxalates in things like kochia and dicumarol and things like sweet clover. Maybe not as many options for local testing. There may be options in the US, but we have to keep in mind that turnaround time might make those a little bit harder to do. And then, of course, there are some things that we can't test for at all, such as that toxin, which is the toxic principle in water hemlock. We mentioned this quite a few times, but again, just, really, unfortunately, in those dry years, things tend to accumulate on top of each other. So a risk factor for many of these poisonous plants is just a lack of preferred other forages out there, poor pasture condition, or very early or late in the season. A lot of these toxic range plants in particular are most dangerous early in the season just because they tend to be the first things to green up, and then they're attractive to livestock. Also things like seaside arrowgrass I mentioned before, which can accumulate salt. So if animals are looking for salt and have a lack of other sources provided, that might be a risk factor for them. And then again, things like field horsetail that maybe livestock would choose to avoid in a grazing situation. They're less able to avoid that when it's been baled up as hay, and there's less sorting that's going to be able to go on. We talked about this again too, but drought or areas not typically used. That's a lot of the cases that we see is when, water has receded. A lot of the toxic range plants tend to kind of grow in wetland or stream bank type areas. And then when that water recedes, they're exposed or more available to livestock. Again, those young animals that are exploring and are not as experienced at knowing which plants to avoid and which not to, those, move to a new pasture and being allowed access to roadsides and other areas like that, and those repeat offenders that Jenifer talked about before. And then some toxicity is influenced by the time of year or the stage of the plant growth and the part of the plant that's eaten, and really the amount consumed. So some of those that I mentioned, like early yellow loco weed and reed canary grass, some of those, it really takes repeated or prolonged exposure over a period of time and a fairly large amount of plant to be consumed to be dangerous. So in terms of actions that you can take, really with those acutely toxic plants, it's about identifying them and restricting access. With the seeded forages, Jenifer went over these considerations of risk management, knowing what you're seeding, reevaluating your stand to see what your actual percentage of each species is, and then forage testing for the things we can test for, and also keeping in mind that the other feed ingredients in the total ration should be taken into account, as well as the water. So these toxic plants aren't usually a very cut and dry. There's a lot of gray area, and it's not always really easy to identify the factors at play. But I hope we've given you some things to think about here tonight. Certainly, if you have any questions, we are happy to answer them now, or, our contact information is here. If you think of anything at a later time, we'd be happy to get in touch with you and talk about them in person.
Thanks, Chelsey. Thanks, Jenifer. That was a great conversation to have about some pretty important topics for folks. I'm going to remind everyone if they have any questions to put them in the Q&A or the chat if you want. We do have a couple questions to start off with in the chat. Mike Malmberg would like to know, what are the toxic principles found in older varieties or native fields of reed canary grass? Can samples be taken of the grass to determine if it has high levels of this toxin?
I don't know if I can be super specific, but reed canary grass, there are several different alkaloids, which can cause things like diarrhea, which the concentration of those alkaloids can kind of change from year to year depending on the conditions. So they can be increased during drought stress or if there was fertilizer applied. I don't actually know if those can be tested for, but I don't consider those also like a acute toxicity either. I think that'd be more of a chronic type, diarrhea causing unthriftiness type of situation.
Jenifer, do you have anything to add?
Actually, just so one of the things, and I don't know that we've seen this necessarily here, in Canada, would be that Chelsey had it on her slide, so that it's called Phalaris staggers. So that in coordination, maybe that stiff sort of gait where the back end looks a little bit weird. some convulsions and recumbency. Reported only in Australia and New Zealand, and sometimes results in sudden death as well. And I think that was some of the things that were they were associated with those tryptamine alkaloids that are present in some of those older varieties of the reed canary grass. I will say there was we actually had one case here in the Northwest where we wondered if this was actually what was going on, because the symptoms were very, very similar to what is noted with that Phalaris staggers. It was an old stand. Interestingly, what happened was that it was a group of grasser cattle that were put out onto this that were put out into this area, contained a high amount of reed canary grass, and we think what happened was that reed canary grass also was accumulating salt, and it was actually salt that those animals were seeking. And so when they were opened up by the vet, they had a huge amount of reed canary grass in them. But yeah, the symptoms that we saw were very similar to that staggers and that sudden death syndrome. So I don't know if that helps you out, Mike, or not, but that is sort of one thing that we did see up here that was kind of interesting.
Thanks, Jenifer. Mike had one other question. He wants to know if Alsike clover is the only clover causing toxicity problems with horses.
I've heard red clover can sometimes be an issue with red. So red clover, if it's got black blotch disease, you can have those photosensitization effects as well. The other thing with red clover is that if it's moldy, you can sometimes have what's called slobbers. And I think that your sort of treatment and prevention is to make sure that they've got access to water. Other than that, and I guess the sweet clover as well, if you have moldy sweet clover, obviously that could be an issue as well.
Can you talk about common tansy? Can it cause abortion in cows?
Oh, Chelsey, do you happen to have that stock poisoning plants book handy? Because I think it's maybe in there.
Yeah, we're talking about a really good resource. It's called Stock Poisoning Plants of Western Canada, and it's an Ag Canada publication that is available online. And what it actually says is that common tansy is not toxic, but ragwort tansy is toxic. So I'm sorry, that's kind of the extent of my knowledge on the tansies, and that's coming from that publication on stock poisoning plants of Western Canada.
Another question we have is, what percentage of hairy vetch can make up a ration?
Oh, that is a great question. And I don't know. You know what? I don't know offhand what that percentage is. And, we talked about sort of that species composition, or that polycrop composition, stand crop composition, as to what you seed versus what comes up. And I think that's really important with some of those things. I don't recall if there is a percentage. Chelsey, do you know in that information that we had, if there was a percentage that was listed? No. And I think, there's more some of the issues that we have are that a lot of these things are new in terms of using them as livestock feed. They haven't necessarily been considered, or they haven't been considered as part of a blend. And there's a lot of those things that we don't necessarily have a good answer for yet. But I think there's also research in those areas. And I think, we need to do a little bit more research so that we know what those safe levels are. And that's probably one of those where we could use a bit more work.
And I think it's fair to Jenifer that some of the information on blends and species don't have the background for Western Canadian as well, right? It might work great in Texas or Oklahoma, but it may not be applicable to Western Canada.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was going to ask both of you if you had any resources that you would recommend for producers to check out if they're out in the field Not sure if they've seen that plant before or if they think that cow maybe just ate some water hemlock. Do you have any resources that you would recommend?
For sure, that stock poisoning plants of Western Canada, that's a great one, and that's often one that I will refer to when I'm looking for things.
There is a website called, I believe it's called Wildflowers of Saskatchewan or Saskatchewan Wildflowers, which is just a great resource of a lot of really great pictures, along with common and scientific names of plants, which I find really, really useful for identification of a lot of the range plants, including some of the toxic ones that we talked about today. So I apologize, I don't know the actual proper name of it, but that's something I can get to you, and we could include the link to that as well.
We've got some specialists, our ag environment specialists. I think they may have a handle on some of those apps. So you know what, I can put a message out to them tomorrow, Adrian, and then maybe I can just send you a note if they've got something else that they're using.
That would be fantastic. We have someone in the comments who suggested PlantNet and Leaf Snap. So some producer participant suggestions there.
Nice.
On behalf of everyone and the Alberta AgriSystems Living Lab, thank you both so much for your generous time with us this evening to give us your expertise. And as one of our comments in the chat said, excellent information. Thank you both very much. So thank you. We look forward to working with you in the future and seeing everyone again at another webinar.